Welcome to Wordpath, the show about Oklahoma Indian languages and the people who are teaching and preserving them. Our topic tonight is the laws and policies that affect languages, especially Indian languages. We'll spend quite a bit of time, though, talking about language in general, since, after all, Indian languages are languages of the world, and I often want to push that perspective that there's nothing that special about Indian languages insofar as they are languages, every bit as rich as any other language, and with a lot of the same issues attached when it comes to preservation. Let's begin with a little bit of a worldwide perspective here. And note throughout this that I think you'll see time and again that language policies often correlate with political reality and with the political status of the speakers, especially of minority languages. Let's just jump around the world a little bit and look at a few different spots just to give us a little bit of that perspective. Let's go to Spain first. You've probably heard of the Basque or Euskara language. It's a minority language of Spain. Others are Catalan and Galician. Now, all of these languages were formerly repressed. In fact, during Franco's dictatorship, they were extremely suppressed and repressed and basically outlawed almost entirely, although now they are protected. Franco was in power from 1937 into the 1950s. Well, actually beyond that. I think this is a typo. Franco was in power for a long time. But under his regime, it was outlawed to teach the Basque language, and the other, basically what I'm saying will apply to all three, but the Basque was especially rudely treated because of political realities connected with the aspirations of the Basque-speaking people. It was forbidden to teach Basque in the schools, to use it in the media or in church. It was forbidden to be spoken or written in public places. Books written in Basque were burned. Basque names were forbidden in baptisms. Instructions on public buildings and tombstones, inscriptions were removed. But now all three of these are sort of secondary official languages of Spanish, and all three of the regions where these three minority languages were spoken have partial autonomy. This change started from about the 60s through the 80s. First, the languages were allowed in church, and eventually they are now taught again in the schools and, in fact, promoted within their regions, and people are fully free to speak these languages, but for a long time it wasn't true. Most people know something about the situation of Irish Gaelic, and actually all of the Gaelic languages to one degree or another. But going now to Britain, Queen Elizabeth I banned traditional Irish music, and there was the Irish language in the music, or just in everyday life, was under attack for quite a long time. The English pretty much violently suppressed both Scots and Irish Gaelic, and to a lesser extent Welsh for centuries. Now the Constitution makes Irish the first official language of Ireland, and the other languages are also experiencing a comeback and wider acceptance in the general population and less suppression. The language of the Lapp people of northern Sweden, Norway, and Russia, known as Sami, was repressed for some years and still probably doesn't have the respect that it should have, but there's a recent Sami Language Act, and again a resurgence of interest in and respect for the Sami language in those countries. Kosovo has been very much in the news recently, and the strife between the ethnic Albanians and the Serbs has to do with religion, history, culture, and also language. If you've been paying close attention to the news stories, one of the strong complaints of the Albanians within Kosovo had to do with being allowed to teach their children in their own language in the schools, which of course was forbidden. In Canada, both English and French are official languages. In Quebec in particular, there's been a lot of strife related to language, which correlates very much with political strife as well. Quebec is vast majority French speaking, but for a long time English had sort of held the sway in public affairs and business a lot more than the French-speaking majority thought that it should, and this had to do with business realities and politics and the fact that the majority of Canadians overall spoke English. More people spoke English than French. And so there was quite a rebellion against this, which correlated very greatly with the move for Quebecois independence. And at one point, it sort of was a pendulum swing. At one point, it was actually forbidden by the Quebec provincial government to use any English signage on any buildings, not only government buildings, but even private businesses or homes or anything. English was just sort of outlawed. And I understand that, I'm not up on the latest on the laws there, but I understand that this pendulum has swung a little bit back towards the middle now, and there's a more equitable treatment of both languages. But language policies and laws have been a very hot topic in Canada, and especially in Quebec, for a long time. So notice that language oppression and political tyranny often go together around the world. Hitler, Mussolini, and other dictators have often considered linguistic unity a necessary precursor to national unity, which they invariably push because it helps them get their way. The fact is, tyrants don't like it when the populace speaks in languages which they don't understand. As Robert Bunge has said, the first thing a victorious people does to a vanquished people is to disarm them, take away their weapons, and take over their lands. This is bad enough. But then there follows something even worse, far worse, the theft of the psyche of the people. He goes on to talk about the role of language repression in all of this. He says, a nation's language is a system of thought and expression peculiar to that nation and is the outward expression and manifestation of that nation's view of the universe. It is the key to psychology and philosophy of a people and is the lens through which the national and individual psyche or soul may be understood. I think that's a pretty insightful general statement, and I think probably Native Americans thinking about their own languages in Oklahoma can relate very strongly to most of that. The connection between psychology, soul, identity, national identity in particular, and your language of heritage is very important. Now, what about official languages? Some countries around the world have an official language and some don't. Only about 1/4 of the countries in the world have 2 or more official languages. And yet we know that multilingualism is really the most commonplace thing around the world. Almost every country consists of people who speak many languages, as the United States does, of course. So we know that the number of languages spoken in a country is always higher than the number of official languages. And there are several reasons for this, having to do with politics, who's influential, economics also, because there's extra costs involved in, for instance, publishing government documents in 18 languages rather than 1 or 2. And there are other factors responsible for this discrepancy. But we're talking tonight about laws and official policies rather than just the reality of who speaks what language. Now, some governments express their support for particular languages by establishing official language institutes. The Académie Française in France is one of the most famous of these. It's a good example. There's also the Institut d'Estudis Catalans, established in 1907 in Spain, which operated even during this period of severe repression of the Catalan language. These institutes, there are others around the world as well, but these institutes usually conduct research. They usually set standards for spelling, word choice, and usage, and they often publish dictionaries which are sort of taken to be the authority on the language in that country. I am aware, by the way, of no such language institutes in the United States, either for Indian languages or any other. Now, let's look a little more closely at the United States. Viewers of this show will immediately think, well, the United States has repressed Indian languages for a long time, and it does correlate a great deal with vanquishing populations and with political strife and so forth, and that's quite true. But let's go back even before the official sort of anti-Indian language policies came into being in this country. The United States government was basically trying to quash the use of Spanish, Russian, and French in the various territories which they had purchased from these respective empires, and substituting the use of English. So, and of course, there had been all sorts of strife going on with the Indian population for a long time, but that didn't really come to become official policy until the 19th century. There was a man named J.D.C. Atkins, who was Federal Commissioner of Indian Affairs in 1887. And I want to read you some, this is rather lengthy, but I think it's very telling about the whole rationale behind the government position with respect to Indian languages. 1887 annual report from J.D.C. Atkins, Federal Commissioner of Indian Affairs. And this was to support his emphasis on teaching English to Indians in general. First of all, he started by quoting an 1868 report of the so-called Peace Commission, which included General Sherman and a number of others not at all knowledgeable with respect to language, but in power with respect to policy. The Peace Commission said, quote, "Through sameness of language is produced sameness of sentiment and thought. In the difference of language today lies 2/3 of our trouble. Schools should be established which children should be required to attend. Their barbarous dialects should be blotted out and the English language substituted to mold them into one homogeneous mass. Uniformity of language will do this. Nothing else will." End of quote. Now, Atkins goes on to say a number of other false things which helped set U.S. policies regarding Indian languages. He says, quote, "When they take upon themselves the responsibilities and privileges of citizenship, their vernacular will be of no advantage. Only through the medium of the English tongue can they acquire a knowledge of the Constitution, of the country and their rights and duties thereunder. To teach Indian school children their native tongue is practically to exclude English and to prevent them from acquiring it. This language, which is good enough for a white man and a black man, ought to be good enough for the red man. The first step to be taken toward civilization, toward teaching the Indians the mischief and folly of continuing in their barbarous practices, is to teach them the English language. The impracticability, if not impossibility, of civilizing the Indians of this country in any other tongue than our own should seem to be obvious. You almost kind of gag when you try to read these quotations. But, you know, this kind of policy was taken very, very seriously. And it is the basis of the whole sort of attitude by the federal government and the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which set up the policies in the boarding schools, which so many Oklahoma Indians cite as being really the beginning of real repression of their own languages, where children were sent off to boarding schools, thereby separated from their parents and their culture that surrounded them. They might have been in school with children of the same tribe and language, but those children were not permitted, in most cases, to communicate with each other in their language. They had to speak only English, which of course they could not speak. So it was pretty rough for kids the first year or two, but they did learn English. And it was all because of this background, which I just read you from the commissioner, saying that he thought that children could not learn two languages. They had to learn one or the other, so it better be English. We know as scientific fact that that's utterly false nowadays, but a lot of people used to believe that. And that it was the only way to civilize the Indians. We could talk all night about how civilized they already were, and that language would have no bearing on that. But he also seemed to have the attitude that the more we're like linguistically, the more we will be like in thought and deed and so forth, which is also, I think, rather nonsensical. If you think of the last person you had a big argument with, was it someone who spoke your language or not, you know? Anyway, I could go on and on about that, and I'm sure most of us who are interested in the subject matter of this program find that pretty ridiculous. But this is an important part of the history of language policy and law in this country. Now let's move to kind of a broader aspect of language law in this country, which is the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, the beginning of the Bill of Rights, which is all about freedom of speech. It says, quote, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble. Now this is used mainly to protect the content of people's speech, but I think it could reasonably be argued that it could protect the language that they choose to speak in as well, or whether they choose to speak in more than one language. Now another very important law, and this is quite recent with respect to language policy in the United States, is the NALA, or Native American Languages Act of 1990. And I want to read you some of that. This will be a little bit lengthy too, some lengthy excerpts, because it's an extremely important law. 1990, passed by Congress. It's now the law. I'm jumping around with some excerpts here, the parts that most specifically talk about language policy very specifically. A lot of this is sort of background about how important Indian culture is, but I'll read the more specific language parts. Paragraph 3, the traditional languages of Native Americans are an integral part of their cultures and identities and form the basic medium for the transmission and thus survival of Native American cultures, literatures, histories, religions, political institutions, and values. Skipping down a couple more paragraphs. There is convincing evidence that student achievement and performance, community and school pride, and educational opportunity is clearly and directly tied to respect for and support of the first language of the child or student. And skipping a little further down, this is sort of whereas that I've been reading, and then it says in section 4, it is the policy of the United States to, and there's a long list under here. The third paragraph here says to encourage and support the use of Native American languages as a medium of instruction in order to encourage and support Native American language survival, equal educational opportunity, increased student success and performance, increased student awareness and knowledge of their culture and history, and increased student and community pride. What a turnaround from the old boarding school days. Skipping down a couple more paragraphs, that it's also the policy of the United States to recognize the right of Indian tribes and other Native American governing bodies to use the Native American languages as a medium of instruction in all schools funded by the Secretary of the Interior. In other words, what used to be the boarding schools is that continuum of that same line of educational structure. And next paragraph, to fully recognize the inherent right of Indian tribes and other Native American governing bodies, states, territories, and possessions of the United States, to take action on and give official status to their Native American languages for the purpose of conducting their own business. And it goes on further, but you can see what a beautiful document that is in terms of really turning the tables on the old policy and stating a very beautiful sentiment and support for Native American languages. Now the problem was, and a lot of Indian people said right away, and some linguists like myself, they said, boy, that's beautiful, what a nice sentiment, but that's all it is, just sentiment. And it's important symbolically, but it doesn't give us anything to help us teach our language in our schools or continue our culture or develop our identity and all the things so eloquently cited there. So there was a follow-up act, 1992, the second Native American Languages Act, which actually allocated some funding for grants to language programs to help preserve Native American languages. And this is the program administered through the Administration for Native Americans in the Department of Health and Human Services, which today so many tribes are applying to try to get major grants for their language programs, and many succeed in doing that. Just a few other miscellaneous facts. I wanted to note that in Hawaii there are 2 official languages. Most states don't have an official language. Well, some do. We're going to get more of that in a minute. But Hawaii has 2 official languages, and they're English and Hawaiian, the native language there. Now let's look a little bit more specifically at Oklahoma. Oklahoma has something called the Open Meetings Law, and the idea of it is to assure that public bodies hold their meetings in a certain way in order to ensure access by the citizenry to the goings-on within the government. Let me quote you part of it. It says, "It is public policy of the state of Oklahoma to ensure citizens' understanding of public policy." Then they mention all levels of government, state, city, county, but they don't mention tribes, bureaus, higher education boards, agencies, etc., supported in whole or in part by public funds. Now the reason I mention this act is because I remember reading a little article in the newspaper. I wasn't able to track that down in time for the program, but the gist of it was that someone was complaining that the Kiowa tribe had held a so-called public meeting and they were holding it in the Kiowa language, and the objection was made that this was counter to the Open Meetings Law. And I was talking to someone in the Attorney General's office today about this, and he had never thought about the question before, but he was searching through the law from and trying to figure out whether there was some case law related to that, and didn't really find anything. But he noted right away that, of course, if the public is there and some of them don't speak Kiowa, it could be argued that the meeting is not accessible to them, and perhaps that was the basis on which people were making this argument. On the other hand, of course, tribal sovereignty is extremely important, and for the state to try to insert itself in between a tribe's meeting and its public would be an odd thing to do. So it's a very interesting point and something to keep an eye on in the future. I'll bet you this issue will come up again. And I noted to the man in the Attorney General's office, isn't it interesting that I've never heard of anyone complaining that when tribes conduct their meetings in English only, that some of the elders who need a translator don't really have access to the meeting in the same way that the English speakers didn't have access to the Kiowa meeting. I don't remember ever hearing anyone complain about that. He found a couple of more laws, just minor things in the Oklahoma statutes that relate to language. For instance, all prescriptions, he said, have to be in English. And a friend of mine was pointing out tonight, well, aren't they actually in Latin? I think a lot of them are. But anyway, I guess prescriptions are not supposed to be in Spanish or Russian or other languages that the lawmakers had in mind when they passed this. They clearly usually have some Latin in them. Now, what else? I want to say quickly that really I can't say very much about tribal language policy in terms of specific laws or officially stated policies. I'm sure there are some that I'm not aware of. But my impression overall, after some years of working with a lot of Oklahoma tribes, is that language preservation sort of proceeds according to the way the budget allows it to and the current government chooses to allot the budget. And that usually in tribal constitutions you won't find a statement about Indian languages in particular. I hope, if this is as true as I think it is, I hope it'll be changing. And if people know otherwise, please write the show and let me know more about this. But I think for the most part the policies of Indian tribes, the unspoken policy is to promote the language of heritage. Often the funding isn't there to do that. But there isn't as strong a policy as, say, the kind of policies that a number of people are pushing nowadays for the federal government. There's a movement called the English-only movement, which is pushing very strongly to actually encode in laws the use of the English language and to exclude the use of other languages in a number of public affairs. I don't see anything that strong. I've never heard of anything that strong in Indian tribes, and basically I haven't heard of any written policies like in a constitution or an overall law that will span the various administrations in the government. And I really wish there were stronger statements of that sort. I think it would help to protect the languages. Now, I see that we're getting a little low on time, so I'll come back to the English-only movement and say a little more about that if I have some time in a few minutes. Let me read you a few things from the United Nations, though, going back to the international level, because I think these are very strong statements that are quite important. In the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is a document of the United Nations, in the preamble, it cites the importance of freedom of speech. It also says in Article 2, quote, everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration without distinction of any kind, such as race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, etc. So language is very specifically protected internationally in terms of United Nations policy. It goes on and says, furthermore, no distinction shall be made on the basis of the political, jurisdictional, or international status of the country or territory to which a person belongs, whether it be independent, trust, non-self-governing, or any other limitation of sovereignty which might bring to mind the special status of Indian nations in the United States. So this is very strongly supportive of minority languages, regardless of the type of government or structure that they are spoken within. It also goes on in Article 22 to say, quote, everyone as a member of society has the right to social security and is entitled to realization through national effort and international cooperation and in accordance with the organization and resources of each state of the economic, social, and cultural rights indispensable for his dignity and free development of his personality, which a lot of people would argue is very relevant to language preservation too. There's also a document called the UN International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and in Article 27 of that, now not all nations, as I understand, have ratified this, but it's an important document nevertheless. Many have. In Article 27 it says, quote, in those states in which ethnic, religious, or linguistic minorities exist, persons belonging to such minorities shall not be denied the right, in community with other members of their group, to enjoy their own culture, to profess and practice their own religion, or to use their own language. Very specifically mentions language. And let me see, shall I talk about English only? Let me talk about Nunavut, because that's a very exciting development in the news recently. I don't know if you've all heard about this, but on April 1st, 1999, the Inuit people took over control of roughly the eastern half of the Northwest Territories, what used to be called the Northwest Territories, in Canada. This is a huge landmass. This was the result of a successful native land claim to the government of Canada. The new territory, called Nunavut, which means our land in Inuktitut, which is one of the native languages, will be subject to the Canadian Constitution, but the territory's 80% Inuit majority will shape life locally, including language policies. And I think this is going to be a very exciting development, and we'll see what happens in terms of educational practice and what language government documents are published in and so forth. The languages spoken there are Inuktitut, which is the primary language, and also, I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, Inuinnaqtun, and English and French. The population is about 22,000, and the landmass is 819,000 square miles. Its capital is Iqaluit, and Paul Okalik is the new premier of that territory. So this is a very new development and very exciting in terms of possibly demonstrating to the rest of the world how regional minority, actually within their region they're of course a majority language, but how regional governments can promote indigenous languages for the good of all, we hope. Now let me sum up a little bit. I'd just like to say in general, keep an eye on your governments and institutions. They may have their eye on your language. But remember too that having the right to learn and teach your language doesn't automatically make it happen. There are practicalities involved. You have to have trained teachers, you have to have funding, you have to have opportunities and structure to make things happen. But certainly I think the existence of official laws and policies is extremely important. It's symbolic, and I see we have about 2 minutes left, so let me take 1 minute to talk a little bit more about the English-only movement. The English-only movement is a very symbolic movement in that it's a movement within the United States to promote English as the only language of the United States, to declare it to be the official language. And there are different versions. There have been constitutional amendments to this effect proposed, and none have passed. Some states have adopted English-only laws. Usually they have the effect of declaring the language to be the official language of the state, or it would be of the United States if it passed at that level. Sometimes there are specific other things, like certain types of use of language will be outlawed. For instance, in California, there are lots of speakers of Spanish, and election ballots have been published for many years in Spanish. In some states, such publication of government-funded materials in any language other than English has been outlawed. And there's a very famous case, even counties have had English-only languages. Dade County in Florida is a famous case where someone was hauled into court because he spoke to his friend in Spanish on the job, and then that had been outlawed. So English-only can get pretty rabid and pretty extreme, but I think it's fair to say that the overall purpose of it is to claim this English language as a symbol of being American. And if there's nothing else that viewers of the Wordpath show believe, I'm sure it's that you don't have to take English language as a symbol of being an American. But I think the very right to speak the language of your choice, including a language of heritage and any other language you choose to study or learn or take on, is really the symbol of what it means to be American. The freedom to make your own choices in these matters and to do the cultural and linguistic and spiritual things that you find to be appropriate in your community and in your region and in your individual life. I think that's the most important thing about being an American. So the next time the English-only people come to Oklahoma, they have been here before and the measures have been defeated for the most part. Next time they come, think very carefully about the symbolism behind such measures. They might just sound like a lot of flag waving, but they could be quite harmful to the continued teaching and promotion of Indian languages. So let's continue to promote and honor Oklahomans' Indian languages. English is fine, but promote and honor your own languages.
Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene manaone kita. Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene manaone kita. Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene manaone kita. Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene manaone kita. Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene manaone kita. Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene manaone kita.